about the background of the assignment a little bit. So what I've asked you to do is to think about a Supreme Court case, and you will be reading about the case, reading the decision in the case, the arguments in the case, and then as a part of your paper, you'll write 3 different things. First, you'll summarize the arguments. You'll explain what you agree with more, which arguments you find most persuasive. And finally, you'll talk about the relationship between the case and wealthy individuals. All right. And, you know, I'm going to come back to this, but let me talk about this a little bit more detail so that this will make some sense to you. All right. Now, the case that you're going to be reading about is called Citizens United versus FEC. It's a 2010 Supreme Court case. And in that case, the Supreme Court struck down a federal law that said that corporations and unions couldn't spend any money on campaign ads right before an election, 30 days before a primary and 60 days before a general election. They said that this law was a violation of the First Amendment. And the First Amendment we've mentioned already in the video lecture that you probably watched already, says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Okay, those are the words. Now, I talked in the other lecture about how, you know, this question about what do we mean when we say abridging the freedom of speech is not crystal clear. There are exceptions to this. There are ways in which we do regulate speech. One of the exceptions that I mentioned in the lecture, for example, is the regulation of signs and things like that. Remember we talked about this? So saying, well, you can't post a sign on this piece of property, or your sign can't be bigger than X. That's a limitation on speech, right? So there are ways in which government regulation of speech has been seen as acceptable. And so what was important about this case is that they said that corporations, the prohibition on corporations of spending their corporate money to purchase campaign ads right before an election is also a violation of the First Amendment. Now, after this case, the Federal Elections Commission, which is the federal body that regulates elections at the federal level, set up a new kind of campaign finance organization called a super PAC. I don't know why I have these things here. This should be one. Sorry. There we go. Super PAC, which was set up and could be approved to accept donations of unlimited size from corporations, unions, individuals, other types of groups to purchase campaign ads and engage in other forms of what we call independent election expenditures. What we mean by independent election expenditures is that they are not supposed to coordinate with the actual people running for office, who have their own campaign committees. So this decision left in place a prohibition on corporations from giving money directly to somebody running for office, but said that it was okay if they spent their money independently. Now, one of the things that's happened a lot or been discussed a lot since then is that there's a lot of winking and nodding going on in terms of how independent these groups are, whether these expenditures are indeed independent. Kennedy wrote the decision of the court. So the first thing that you're going to be reading is his decision with which 4 other justices agreed. And so that becomes the decision of the Supreme Court. Now, the other piece that you're going to read is by a guy named Stevens. And Stevens wrote a dissent in the case, which is a chance for a justice to say, these are the reasons I don't agree with the decision of the court. And 3 other justices signed on to that dissent. And so the paper is going to be an analysis of these 2 arguments and a contrast between them. And you're going to be making arguments about or explaining, which of their arguments you find most persuasive. All right. Now, let me just talk a little bit more about campaign finance. So I mentioned already the context of the First Amendment, and campaign finance is pretty complicated. This question about how does money get spent, how can it be, who can give money to what. And I've also given you this chart here. So it's one of the documents that's you'll find on the Blackboard website, pointing out that in the current legal framework, we have these different kinds of organizations and individuals can give to these different kinds of organizations, right? So it's just giving you a sense, and it's laying out what we mean by these things, what a political action committee is, what a super PAC is, what are the limits, if there are any limits, and rules about disclosure as well, okay? Now, what I want to do just to make this a little more clear, because you'll see this discussion in the court cases. In the court case, they are talking about political action committees, which is what I call an old-fashioned political action committee, which is the kind that was in effect before the case. And what comes about after the case is a super PAC. So super PACs were not in existence before that. They're set up to regulate the money that's allowed to be spent now after Citizens United, okay? And I want to show you through a different website the difference between a political action committee and a super PAC, and try and illustrate those so that you can see the change that Citizens United resulted in, so we can get a sense of what the debate was really about, okay? So let me take you to a website called opensecrets.org. You can get extra credit on this paper by going to this website and pulling some data out of it. And that's described at the bottom of the prompt as well. What opensecrets.org does, it's run by an organization called the Center for Responsive Politics. And they take data that is reported to the federal government by these organizations and takes that data and puts it into a database that we can use. So we are essentially looking at federal data reported to the federal government. So let me first take you to Political Action Committee. This is an old-fashioned political action committee, and let's just take a look at the top one here, National Association of Realtors. Okay, and I want to show you who can give money. I want to show you a picture of who is it that's giving money to this organization first. And you'll see it's a very long list. You'll notice that these are all individuals on this list. There can't be anything but individuals, and maybe other political action committees. But mostly you'll see individuals giving money to this PAC. They all work for real estate companies, which is not surprising. So they are realtors, but they're giving their own individual money. And the amounts, you can see, quite uniform. $5,000, almost every one of these contributions, about $5,000. That's the maximum they can give to this PAC, okay, in an election cycle. And then the PAC can turn around and give that money out to people running for office. So let's look at the recipients of their money. So these are people that they're giving the money to, and you can see these are people in the House of Representatives, and it's a very long list. Almost probably every single person in the House and the Senate receives some money from this PAC. And you can see that the amounts are very uniform also. They're all under $10,000. $10,000 is the maximum amount of money they can give to somebody running for the House or the Senate. And so that's kind of what that looks like, the recipients. Okay, so a PAC, a regular old PAC, can give money directly to somebody running for office. They can give money to this guy, Ralph Abraham, who was running for the House in Louisiana. But corporations cannot give money directly to PACs. So on that list of donors, you will not find any corporations listed as the donor, right? You can't give corporate money directly. Now let's look at super PACs and see what kind of difference we see with super PACs. All right, now a super PAC, and these are the organizations set up after the case that you're going to be studying. I'm just going to click on the top super PAC that raised the most money, and that's the one that was supporting Hillary Clinton in the last election. I'll look at that first, and then I'll look at one supporting somebody from the other side. First, let's look at the donors to this PAC, right? Who's giving money to the super PAC? And one of the things that you'll notice, I'm going to go this way because it's more explicitly all the information that we'll find here. You'll see the contributor. These are individuals. And you will also find, in some cases, corporations and unions on this list. So if you scroll down far enough, one of the things we're seeing is that the top donors tend to be individuals giving their own private money, but you do also see corporations and unions, and these were allowed. This is what was permitted after Citizens United, and you can see the amounts here, quite a bit larger than regular old PACs. In fact, this is unlimited. This donation is $6 million, but you could add 3 zeros to that. You could add 6 zeros to that. It doesn't matter. It's unlimited. They list their occupation, but this is private money if the contributor is an individual. And again, quite different than a regular old PAC. Now, if you look at the candidates, now this is called targeted candidates. They're spending their money in support of this candidate, but they cannot give their money directly to the candidate. It's called independent expenditures, okay? And so if I look at different, super PACs, it'll say that they're not allowed to give money directly to federal candidates. So that's an important distinction between a super PAC and a regular old PAC. Let me just show you, just so that we can sort of contrast here. I'm having a hard time moving my mouse around very well. If you take a look at some of these other PACs. There was one that I wanted to look at that was really illustrates this very well. Well, I'll just look at the second biggest. Very similar in terms of the donors. Again, very large donations. $10 million to this super PAC made directly by a corporation. So it's a corporation listed here instead of an individual, and this is the corporation this is the super PAC that was supporting Bush in the election early on, the presidential election we just held. Okay, so this, it gives you some idea of what is at stake. Now let me take you to the decisions themselves so that we can look at them a little bit. This is the decision of the court. So this is written by Kennedy. Justice Kennedy delivered the opinion of the court. This is the way the Supreme Court decisions always start off. And you're going to see a series of arguments that he's going to make in this piece, supporting his position that that the law that restricted corporations from purchasing campaign ads is a violation of the First Amendment. Okay. Now, I want to take you to the dissenting argument from Stevens. Okay. And part of the reason I want to show you this before I talk about Kennedy much more is because Stevens is a little more clear in the way that he lays out his arguments, and I'm suggesting that you use this as a framework for structuring your summary. So if you scroll down to the second page of Stevens here in this paragraph, you'll see that he says that the ruling rests on several premises. What he means there is that, Kennedy's argument includes several different kinds of, Kennedy's decision includes several arguments. First, that it was a ban on corporate speech. Second, that the First Amendment precludes regulatory distinctions based on speaker identity, including the corporation identity. And third, that the First Amendment tradition was one in which corporations would have been given this kind of a right except for these problematic decisions called Austin and McConnell. Okay, so Stevens says here are these three main arguments, and then he goes through and addresses each one, and you'll see it very clearly. First, here's the argument about the so-called ban. Now, obviously, when he says so-called ban, right, what he's saying is that it's not a ban. So they differ quite fundamentally on this question, with Kennedy saying it is a ban, or it was a ban, and Stevens saying no, it wasn't a ban, it was simply a restriction. And here's the second prong, identity-based distinctions. And here is the third prong, First Amendment tradition. And then Stevens follows all of this with a long discussion of corruption, which is, I'm calling the fourth main argument in Stevens' dissent. And all of these four arguments you will also find in Kennedy. So what I'm going to want you to do is go through these arguments, the decision and the dissent, and find out what they say about each of these four issues, okay, for both of them. And that's what you're going to do in your summary. And then you're going to say which one of these you find most persuasive, why you find it most persuasive. The last issue that I want you to think about is the fact that this decision was about corporations spending their corporate money in elections. But what's happened since the decision, which was kind of a surprise to a lot of people, is that the super PAC framework has been used a lot more effectively by very wealthy individuals. than it has by corporations. And I want you to just reflect on that a little bit and think about whether um, one would also find that problematic or not. Now, it is a pretty straightforward assignment, right? So it's not a big research paper or anything like that. It's an analysis of these two arguments. And it's a challenge to you, really, to read the original arguments. There are lots of summaries. There are lots of other people that have written about these decisions. But I have always found that it's much more empowering if you actually read the decision for yourself as opposed to relying upon other people's summary of these decisions. And so that's really what I want you to do. You're going to need to make sure that you don't get lost in the forest for the trees. Some of the language is going to be, I should say, unfamiliar to you. You'll see a lot of citations. Read past that stuff so that you can figure out what they're saying. Both of these authors